The NES had so many classic games, and many of these grew to be some of the most popular franchises in all of video games. But what about the games that didn't get the NES seal of approval? Today we're talking about co-op, unlicensed NES games. We're just going to do this in alphabetical order. Alien Syndrome. This is a top-down run-and-gun game that is clearly inspired by the movie Aliens. You can play it co-op. You wander around this space station, I guess, and you try to save all of the hostages or survivors or whatever you want to call them. I actually think this game's pretty good, and it's much better than the Sega Master System version. You could only play the game 2-player with alternating turns, and that's just pointless. I think a lot of people have heard about Chiller. This game is known for being extremely violent for its time. It's a light gun shooter that can actually be played co-op on NES, and I think it's the only example of that existing on the console. But you can also play it with a controller, just moving around the cursor. Obviously, that's not as fun. You go through graveyards, torture chambers, and dark hallways, blasting monsters and various creatures along the way. I think this game's actually pretty good. CJ the Elephant was part of the Quattro arcade cartridge that included a number of unlicensed games in one package. This one's probably the best of the bunch. It's a 2D platformer where you play as 2 elephants. It's definitely not the best platformer on the system, but once you get used to the mechanics, it's not terrible. Double Strike is a horizontal shoot 'em up that's pretty generic. You can play through the whole thing co-op. The visuals aren't too bad. Nothing really stands out in this game. Dudes with Attitude, or Trolls on Treasure Island, is pretty weird. You control these bouncing heads that are wearing sunglasses because all the attitude, and you just collect jewels. This one took me a while to figure out. It's okay, I guess. Final Fight 3 is a bootleg of the Super Nintendo version of Final Fight 3, and this is actually really great. You can play through the whole thing co-op, the graphics are impressive, and the gameplay is all intact here. The only downside is the ungodly amount of flickering, but I think that's to be expected for what's going on visually here. This is actually one of the best beat-em-ups on the NES. So if you're looking for some lesser-known games, some bootlegs, some unlicensed games, this should be at the top of your list. Gaiopolis plays kind of like a mix between Akari Warriors and a beat-em-up. You move around vertically and you fight the enemies on your way. When I saw screenshots of this game, I actually thought it looked really good, but then I played it and yeah, it's really clunky, and yeah, it just it doesn't play well. It's unfortunate. So everybody knows Gauntlet, and this is a game that did have an official release on the NES. But Tengen also released it. So this is one that has one of those weird black cartridges. And yeah, it's basically the same. This is just Gauntlet. So if you like that, you'll like this, because that's what it is. Krazy Kreatures is one of my favorite unlicensed NES games. And it's the one that surprised me the most. Just seeing gameplay and screenshots of it, it doesn't look interesting whatsoever. But once you get into it, it's actually very addicting. You and a friend each control a cursor and you move around, moving the various animals and crazy creatures into place, and you're just matching them up and then they disappear. It seems really simple and maybe not very interesting, but once you get into it, I swear this is one of the best co-op games on the NES. Master Hu is a 2D platformer where you play as 2 kung fu masters and you fight the enemies. You have to collect items in order to move forward, and sometimes the items are hidden in weird spots, like just a tree, sometimes they're up high somewhere, sometimes they're in plain sight, and sometimes they're hidden. This actually becomes quite a frustrating experience, and also the gameplay's not good. Mission Cobra is another shoot 'em up, but this one is vertical. It's also known as sidewinder. I don't have much to say about this game. It's very generic and very mediocre. Tengen also released a version of Miss Pac Man, and you can play through this entire game in co-op, where one player is Miss Pac Man and one is Pac Man. Everybody knows this gameplay, so I don't need to explain it, but this is actually just a really good version of Miss Pac Man, and I think pretty much all games are better in co-op, so play this version. There's a game called Rock Ball, which is pretty much a port of Chu Man Fu from the TurboGrafx 16. You and a friend, you push around these balls and you put them in the space that they need to go. You can also use them to defend yourself against the enemies. I haven't played this one as much as the TurboGrafx version, but I absolutely love the TurboGrafx version of this game. It's visually appealing and the gameplay is intact. Skull and Crossbones is another Tengen game, and it is pretty terrible. You can play it in split-screen co-op, but the weird thing is when you see your partner on your screen, all you see are their shoes. I'm guessing this is some kind of attempt to save resources and not having to show the sprite twice. I don't know. The combat here is terrible. You never feel like you are making good contact, and the platforming is terrible, and the exploration is terrible. This is really one of my least favorite games on the NES. Tagin Dragon is a weird one. You play as these dragons and you go around the maze and fight other dragons. It took me a while to figure this one out, but apparently you just have to go up and you bite the other dragon's tail. You don't push a button to do this, you just walk up to them and you do this enough and then they die, and then you can exit the maze and go on to the next level. It's a simple enough concept, but the execution is terrible, and it's just hard to navigate and go around corners. And there's just no visual evidence of your attacks making contact. When you do defeat an enemy, it just ends up not being very satisfying. Tengen also released a version of Tetris on the NES, and this has to be the best version of Tetris on the console. You can play through the entire thing in co-op, where you drop the blocks simultaneously with your partner, and you have to coordinate where to drop each block. This ends up being a really strategic game that involves a lot of communication. I'm not the biggest fan of puzzle games in general, or Tetris to be honest, but if I were to play Tetris, this would be the version. Vindicators is a vertical scrolling run and gun shoot 'em up, but you're not running, you're in tanks. So whatever you want to call that. This game's pretty solid. This was another one by Tengen. The gameplay feels good. I don't have much else to say about it, but this is one of the better unlicensed games. One of the games I just discovered was Xybots. I had played the Atari Lynx version and the arcade version, but I didn't know there was a version on the NES, and it includes a split-screen co-op mode, which is just impressive to see for the time. You and a friend navigate the pseudo 3D environment, shooting down enemies, gathering points, buying upgrades and maps, and moving to the exit to move to the next level. This one's definitely a hidden gem when it comes to co-op NES games. It's not the best one, but I never hear anyone talk about it. So those are all of the co-op unlicensed NES games that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's plenty of other ones from different regions and different developers, but this is the list that I was able to put together. If you know of any other unlicensed NES games with co-op, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, you should watch our top 30 best co-op games on NES video. Thank you for watching.